Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to set up Azure Arc using Azure Arc with Windows Subsystem for Linux and micro-k8s. Now, if you're not familiar with Azure Arc, it's basically the control plane from Azure extended into infrastructure that is outside of Azure. Now, that means that you can use Azure to control things that aren't in an Azure data center. So it gives you the ability to apply things like workloads and policy and security and different kinds of monitoring tools into many of these different environments. So let's take a look at kind of the intent behind Azure Arc and why you might find it useful. And then I'm going to show you how to set it up using micro-k8s on Windows Subsystem for Linux so you can get a feel for it in the Kubernetes context, because this has some very unique applications that I think are very useful for things like IoT and edge computing. So the journey to Azure Arc really starts with on-prem. Now, on-prem just refers to a broad category. It means something that's running outside of the public cloud. And that's usually in somebody's data center that they might have purchased and they're running. It might be a server closet in the basement of your building, maybe the top floor of your building, or something like that. In any case, it's some kind of physical server that you're either leasing or you own, and you're racking that server, and then you're managing the server itself, the physical network, and all of the apps that are running on that server. And you might have one server, you might have multiple servers, but in any case, it's some kind of configuration where you're a little bit closer to the physical hardware that's actually running. Now, in this case, you were running that and it was fine. It worked great and everybody was happy with that. But the problem with it is it became very expensive, especially for enterprises, as they began to add more and more servers, and it became very technical. And to kind of get away from that, you were trying to figure out ways to kind of mitigate the costs and the effort needed to maintain these complex data centers. And that's where the public cloud came in. Now, the public cloud really rose in the mid to late 2000s, but it really became popular in the early 2010s. And the rise of services like Azure and AWS and GCP were able to take a lot of the complexities of maintaining a data center and commoditize it so that you could have on-demand compute. So you basically just create a virtual machine and you don't have to worry about the infrastructure. You don't have to worry about the physical servers that's running on, or any of the networking, or any of the physical security, or any of that. And that's what the public cloud was originally offering. Now, it wasn't exactly easy to give up these on-prem data centers, and it's truthfully still not easy to do that, because there are certain use cases where an on-prem data center makes sense. And so the reason for that is because you might need to co-locate applications close to the end users for performance reasons, or maybe there is some kind of data sovereignty rule that you have to apply and you can't put it in the public cloud. You have to use on-prem to keep it geographically located within the borders of a country or a particular geography. There's a lot of reasons like that where on-prem still makes sense. And then there's a lot of reasons that cloud makes sense. So figuring out how to make these two work together is where we ended up creating hybrid cloud. And hybrid cloud was basically treating the public cloud as an extension of our on-premise data center. And we were basically using the same patterns and principles in the public cloud that we're applying on-prem. The biggest difference, though, is instead of having to maintain the physical hardware, all the virtualization and all the virtual networking and all that was just maintained by the cloud provider, not by the professionals that were running my business. So all of that created the hybrid cloud, and that worked fine for a while. Now, with more time, having more experience and more lessons learned, more and more workloads were shifting into the cloud. So Azure was one of those, and less was being put on-prem. And so people still needed these on-prem environments, but they really liked the power of the cloud. And they were trying to figure out, how can we really get the best of both worlds, or maybe even think of not the cloud as an extension of my data center, but think of my data center as an extension of the cloud. And that's where we get into something like Azure Arc. So the last 5 years for cloud computing have been very exciting for cloud providers, because the cloud itself has become front and center rather than this kind of sidecar to the data center. No longer do people think of data center first and cloud second. They think of cloud first, data center second. And there's been this migration effort to get out of maintaining complex data centers into the cloud. Having done that, though, a lot of companies are finding that even though they would love to use the cloud, they can't really get out of the data center for a number of reasons. And I've already named a few of those. One being latency issues, another one being reliable connectivity to the workload itself. Another one might be the data sovereignty issues. And there's a plethora of other reasons, but they like to use the cloud and they like the management that the cloud provides, and they love the integration that the cloud provides and the simplicity that the cloud provides. So instead of thinking about the cloud as an extension of the data center, they think of the data center as an extension of the cloud. So Azure Arc has a lot of ways that this is being done. One way is through VMware. Now, VMware is used for obviously managing virtual machines, but it has integrations with Azure Arc, so you can manage a lot of the aspects of VMs from the Azure control plane, so security updates and things like that, but it's integrated with the VMware hypervisor solutions. Another one is with VMs themselves. So this will allow you to maintain VMs, it's basically using agents on the VM, regardless of the hypervisor, but you can manage a lot of the aspects of virtual machines using the Azure control plane directly without the need of integrating with a hypervisor. Another way is through SCVMM, which is System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And that's basically a tool for managing virtual machines in a data center at scale or in the cloud, but its integration with Azure Arc allows you to have a lot of the controls managed by Azure. But in any case, you're using that tool, but the integrations it has with Azure allow you to just use Azure tooling rather than having to use two separate tools. Another one is with Azure Stack HCI. Now, Azure Stack HCI is Azure Stack Hyperconverged Infrastructure, which is, in a way of thinking, another region, essentially a private region running on your own hardware, but it gives you the ability to use Azure resources on that infrastructure. And so you can kind of extend Azure VMs and things like that onto Azure Stack HCI, and it will allow you to have the Azure control plane managing that without having to use another hypervisor or some kind of other integration. So it's just another more direct application of Azure into something that isn't running on Azure's data centers. And lastly, the one that I like the most is Kubernetes. With this one, you get to maintain Kubernetes clusters using Azure. And this allows you to deploy containers and containerized workloads from Azure to a Kubernetes cluster. And so this gives you a visibility and security controls and also management controls onto Kubernetes clusters, all within the scope of Azure. And so this allows you to do a lot of things with edge computing, especially edge computing, but there's other applications, of course, for larger Kubernetes clusters that might be on-prem that you want to manage or deploy Azure services to using Azure Arc. So all of these, in a way, kind of create this Azure outside of Azure experience, and they're all going to vary in differing ways, but you get a very similar result where you're no longer bound to an Azure data center Azure region. You have all of your workloads managed by Azure, although the actual physical compute that's running those workloads is something outside of Azure. And now Azure has been extended beyond the walls of Azure's data center into your own infrastructure. So to show you how you can easily set this up, I'm going to be using a system that is built on top of Windows. So I'm going to have Windows 11 in my case, and then of course WSL2, and in that I'm going to have Docker and the Docker CLI on the host, and then I'm going to have Kubernetes, and then on top of that kubectl to interact with it. Now my concern here is mostly with the Kubernetes context here, which is going to be running micro-k8s, and then I'm going to be using kubectl and the Azure CLI to configure this guy, because that's really the integrations that Azure Arc is going to have with Kubernetes in this case. So if you want to learn how to set this stack up, you can check that out in a video that is linked right here. And I'll also put it in the video description down below, but this will get you a Kubernetes context that you can use with development. Now, of course, it wouldn't be one that you would use in a production workload, but if you want to familiarize yourself with some of the kinds of things that you can do with Arc, this is a great way to test it and play around with it. So the first thing that we'll need on top of the things that we've already installed is the Azure CLI, which is actually really easy to install. I'm using the Ubuntu 22.04 distro for WSL2. So it's a single command. And so I'll put this in the video description down below. Basically going to download a script and run it against Bash. So again, very easy to do, but I've already installed this, so it's not going to add anything to my system. But in any case, it's just a single command, looks like that. Once it's done, you will have the Azure CLI up and running. So once you have that installed, now we need to get Azure configured as well as the local environment logged into Azure. So this is pretty straightforward. We need to do a login of sorts. So we're going to use the AZ login command, but we're going to use a device login so that this will allow us to authenticate against this using a code. So to do a device login, you type in AZ login, use device code, and then you will get a window that will give you the ability to log in a particular device. And the device is really just the WSL2 environment here. And so it's going to provide you with a code inside of the CLI right here, which I'm going to grab. And then I'm going to paste that code in here. And then that's going to correlate that machine with my login. And then I'm going to simply log in and then hit continue. And it's going to allow this machine to use the Azure CLI. And then everything should kick back to the login here in just a second. So I can close that window and this will pick up that login and then authenticate me against Azure. The next thing we need to do is add the Azure Arc extensions to the Azure CLI. These are not installed by default. So to add them is pretty straightforward. Just run this command, AZ extension add, and then -- connected Kates. And that will install the extension. I've already done it, but you can run that command and it will add the extensions to add the Azure CLI. And once that's done, we can register some providers. Now, providers are basically providers on Azure. These aren't local things that need to be enabled on a per subscription basis. These are not enabled by default, so you have to enable them manually. And it can take a minute to do. So you can just run some AZ commands. So AZ provider register, and we're going to do Kubernetes, and then we're going to use another command for Kubernetes configuration and another one for extended location. And these are the ones that are used on Azure to enable Azure to manage a local Kubernetes context. So once those are enabled, you will be up and running. It can take a few minutes to get these up and running in your subscription. You can check the progress by running this command here, AZ provider show. It'll show you a table, and then you can do that for these other providers as well. And it will tell you registration state, and this is what you want to watch for right here. And then you want to see that as registered. Once it's registered, that means that you can use Azure Arc to manage a local Kubernetes cluster. So while those registrations are happening in the background, you can install kubectl and configure this environment. It's really easy to do. So if you're running microkates, you already installed Snapcraft, which enables you to also install kubectl. To do that, you just do snap install, but we're going to do this with sudo, and run that, and that will install it using classic mode. And basically that means that it's not going to be in the Snapcraft environment. It's going to install it like it would be a more classic installation. And once that's installed, you'll have kubectl installed, and then kubectl is just the CLI. There is a folder that kubectl uses called kube.kube, and it's in your user folder. So you can do cd tilde dat, and then you can do a /kube, and that will take you to the folder. Since I'm already there, I don't need to do it. And this is where the Azure CLI is going to look for the Kubernetes configuration file that enables you to connect to your cluster. So with that, you should be able to export the configuration from microkates. So to do that, we're going to use a microkates command right here called sudo microkates config, and then this is going to export it to a config file, and then that's the native file or the default file for Kubernetes configuration. So I don't have any other ones on this, so we're just going to output that, and then I should have a config file right here, and that contains all the information needed to connect my microkates configuration up to an Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster. So with that, I am now ready to add my microkates cluster to Azure Arc. Okay, now that we have got our Kubernetes environment configured, now I can just simply add it to Azure Arc, and that's what you'll use the Azure CLI for. So we're going to create a resource group. If you have one that you already want to use, you can simply use that one. I'm just going to create a new one here. I'm going to call it Blaze Azure Arc 1 and put it in East US, and the output is table. That's just for formatting. And this will create the resource group, and then that's going to run very quickly. That operation doesn't take very long at all. The next one might take a few minutes, and that's to actually run the connection between the Azure Arc and your local microK8s environment, because what it's going to do is it's going to download a bunch of stuff. And most of these are going to be pods that it needs to put into your Kubernetes cluster so that it can manage it using those pods. And so this will use that kube config file that we just saw, and it will connect the Azure Arc to this Kubernetes cluster and then install some of the resources that Azure needs to manage the cluster. And once that's done, we should be able to see this cluster in the Azure portal and also be able to manage this from the Azure portal as well. So let's go ahead and run this and let this run. And it might take a few minutes to actually deploy this setup to my cluster. So you just have to be patient. So once the Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster is done, you can now see it in the portal. So I've had the Azure portal up and running. You can search for that by simply typing Arc into the search bar and selecting Azure Arc. And this will give you the overview pane for Azure Arc. And you can see that it has the ability to view all of your Arc enabled resources. And so you have management right here, but the things that are most interesting for infrastructure are under the infrastructure tab, or rather menu right here. You can see virtual machines, Azure Stack HCI, Kubernetes, VMware vCenter, SCVMM. Of course, we're going to be mostly interested in Kubernetes clusters, but you can also see the data services that are enabled, as well as some of the application services like API management, app services, event grid and functions, and so on. And then pricing down here. The Azure Arc service itself is free, but some of the services that it will deploy to the infrastructure that you deploy, of course, are going to be billed. But the ability just to use Arc is not something that's going to cost anything. So we're mostly interested in our Kubernetes clusters. So if I have more than one, I will see a list right here, but I only have the single one that I just enabled. So Azure Arc is enabled for this particular cluster. And then once you drill down into each of your cluster, you can get information about your Kubernetes cluster. So you can see your namespaces, your workload, your services, and your ingress, your storage, and your configuration. Now, workloads, of course, is going to be things like your deployments and all of the other similar things that are going to be a part of that. And they show you the namespaces associated with those, as well as the workloads. And we're going to deploy one here in a minute as a demo. And then you also can see your namespaces, and it'll show you all of the namespaces available that you have on your cluster. Azure Arc is the one that is installed by Azure Arc, but you have your ingress and your kube associated namespaces for the various ones that are going to be installed by microK8s. And ingress is just the ingress controller that I enabled on this guy. The default namespace is, of course, for anything that you don't specify a namespace. And that's where if I deployed something without the namespace, like my Commander Keen demo that I'm going to do in a minute, it's going to go in the default namespace. And you can see that running right here under workloads as well. But you can also see your services and ingress. So this is going to show you all of your services that you have deployed. It's going to show you the type, and then, of course, your ingress, which I don't currently have any. But if you had ingresses configured, it would show up right here. And depending on the controller that you were using, it would also show up here as well. And then, of course, for configuration, you have config maps and secrets. Config maps, of course, give you the ability to create application configurations that will provide you some level of mapping of settings to Kubernetes manifests, and then secrets management right here. And this is the ability to mount secrets inside of your pods once they're up and running. And so that gives you the ability to have secrets management baked right into your Kubernetes cluster. And you can see that all right there. Now, under settings, there's a lot of things you can do with this. I could go into deep details about all of these. The one that I really want to kind of just touch on is extensions, but notice what you can do with this. You can do open service mesh. GitOps is your Kubernetes DevOps experience. It allows you to basically build and run containers using some of the tooling that's available from things like GitHub or Azure DevOps. And then policy is the ability to extend Azure Arc into Kubernetes clusters to apply Azure policy on top of that. And then you can also get insights for monitoring. You can get app insights right here. And then you can get alerts, logs, and workbooks that will be triggered based on different kinds of scenarios there. And then if you have all of the different kinds of things that you can manage with that. Now, I'm not going to get into any of that for this particular video. I'm just kind of touching on that. What I do want to look at briefly is extensions. And this is where you can extend Azure services into your Kubernetes cluster beyond just the managing the cluster itself. So here's a lot of things that are kind of either in preview or production. You have API management, which is APM, for providing some level of proxies for your applications or APIs that might be running in your cluster. You have application services extension. This is basically the ability to extend things like app services into your cluster, and that will turn on things like functions and so on. You have Key Vault service provider, and this will allow you to use Key Vault with your secrets management as part of that. And then you have Azure Machine Learning extension, so you can deploy Azure Machine Learning, different kinds of services related to that into your cluster. And then container apps, of course, makes sense for Kubernetes, and container apps is that serverless ability that allows you to basically run a serverless way of container management inside of your Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. And then, of course, Event Grid is the ability to manage the different kinds of events that are happening inside of your Kubernetes cluster and kind of bubble those up into Azure as things happen on your cluster. So lots of different things going on here, and this is constantly evolving. So some of these previews will be GA'd, and then of course they'll have new features that are enabled as Arc is extended. So all of that to say is Arc is a very powerful tool for managing Kubernetes, but not only Kubernetes, but also giving you services on that particular cluster, whatever that might be. So to deploy a service to Kubernetes, I'm just going to deploy a containerized application to this using the Azure portal and then show you it running on my local Kubernetes cluster, but I'm not going to use the Kubernetes command line. I'm going to use Azure portal to deploy that with. So to create a workload in this, I'm just going to deploy a Kubernetes manifest that I've already prepared for this. So I'm going to go down to workloads and click add right here. And I'm going to edit my YAML right here inside of the Azure portal. So I already have my YAML configured. I'm going to paste it in. So to show you kind of what this looks like, it's pretty straightforward. It's basically just a YAML file to deploy a deployment and a service in the same YAML file. And so it's going to expose something on a node port using the target port of back 80. It's going to ignore this one right here because it is using a node port, but then it's going to point it to this container down here, and the container is going to get from Docker Hub because I've already built the container. It's going to pull it from Docker Hub. Now you can integrate this with Azure Container Registry for sure, but I'm using Docker Hub for a publicly listed container. In case, once you have that, you click add and it will create a deployment and a service. And that'll take a few seconds to deploy or up to a few minutes, depending on the size of the container and a lot of the other factors that are involved with that. But it's actually deploying it not on Azure, but on my local context here that is running Kubernetes. So we'll let that deploy, and then I'll show you locally what it's doing using kubectl, and then we'll load it up and see what it looks like in a browser. So I've deployed that using the Azure portal. Now I should be able to see the workload here just to show you what that looks like. So I have keen deployment, 1 of 1 ready, and deployed it 3 minutes ago, which is about right. And then if I go over here to my services, I should be able to see my service is available as well. And that shows me that it's working in the portal at least. So I can see the same information on my local context. So if I come over here to my command prompt, or rather my shell, into my WSL environment, I should be able to run kubectl commands and get pods like this, or rather get deployments. You get the same information. And so there's my keen deployment, 1 of 1 ready. And then if I do services, you should be able to see the same information here for services. And you can see that it's running on that 3000 port as a node port. So let's go ahead and launch a new instance of Chrome here. And let's get a new browser tab up. And this should allow me to get back into that guy. So it's on port 30,000 rather, at that IP address. I just know that IP address because I've been working with this, but it's the IP address for the micro-K8s instance, or rather the WSL instance that's local. And if I click on VNC here, I should be able to log into my instance of DOSBox running inside of this. And if you see me do demos, you've seen me do this demo many times. This is going to just install Commander Keen on a pod running on a local Kubernetes context, but this was all deployed by way of Azure. Now, there's no way to like get this to go back to Azure. There might be a way to hack that up, but I could if I wanted to. But in any case, it's just running the game now. And this game, it's just a non-trivial workload. I didn't want to do like Hello World, but it's just showing you that this is deploying something that's a little bit more than just a simple web service that's running inside of a browser. Now, if all works well, I should have the system sound working on this, and should be able to hear the squeaks and squawks of a 16-bit DOS game running inside of a container on my local box right here. But this isn't streaming over the internet, but it's pretty playable for the most part. So again, it's just showing you how to use microcates with WSL and then all of the tools that go with that for getting it Arc enabled and then deploying a workload through the Azure portal down to a Kubernetes cluster. So all in all, it's a very cool way to manage Kubernetes. I really think that this is a very useful tool, especially for anybody that's going to be using Kubernetes in an edge context, or if you're going to be managing a distributed set of Kubernetes clusters across a variety of different infrastructures. So definitely something you'll want to check out, and something that you'll want to be aware of as it evolves, because it's certainly going to be adding new services and new features to this as this product continues to grow in popularity. So there's a couple things that I want to do with this. One of them is to work with Dapr in this context. So Dapr, of course, is a framework for building microservices, and I want to show you how you can use that with microcates or Kubernetes in general and use Arc to manage it. And then I want to look at also using the custom vision service from Azure Cognitive Services. And that will allow me to basically take an AI model and then containerize it, then expose that as a way that I can attach something like a camera to this, and then use the camera to interact with that particular module. And then that will allow me to do object detection in a edge environment, but I trained the model using Azure services. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with this, especially in the edge context. So that's kind of the ultimate goal of doing work in this kind of context. So look forward to those videos. And if you like this content, please like and subscribe to the channel. Also share it with your friends. Drop me a comment in the comment section down below and let me know how you're doing with this kind of stuff. I'd love to entertain ideas for videos and all of that kind of stuff. So as always, thanks for watching and hope to see you on a future video.
If you like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel by clicking on the subscribe button. You can also like this content by clicking on the thumbs up, or share this content with your friends, and also comment in the comment section down below. You can also find me online at www.blaze.net or on Twitter at @theonemule. And as always, thanks for watching.